a bit of a story, because Joan and her husband did collecting, and the result of that collecting, Jennifer got involved, and the result of that, a lot of people got involved. It was a kind of snowball. I wouldn't be here today. I guess none of us would be here today, because it all came out of work. Tom and Joan, that was the start, really, of the Reading Cloggies. What more can I say? Thank you, Joan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me. I came down for the 25th anniversary of the Cloggies, which made me feel, you know, gosh, what a long time. And in fact, it's 40 years since we first started collecting. And so Jennifer's my dancing daughter, and Chris Medall of the Newcastle Cloggies is my dancing grandson, in a sense, and he also came out of the Reading Cloggies, which is rather nice. My husband was absolutely delighted. I mean, to see 200, I think it's about 200 people here today, something like that, is lovely. And to see the children dancing as well, which is absolutely super, because somebody's going to carry this on, which is lovely. But I thought, as I say, pay tribute to Tom, because his was the inspiration and the determination and the sheer guts that made it possible. I was his very willing helper and his reader and his amanuensis. But after our first 2 trips to the Hebrides and to the border countries in Scotland, I didn't actually do any collecting in the field except on family holidays. That was the only time I was able to do it. But we read and we read and we read everything that we could lay our hands on about Scotland and the Scots. We read. And in fact, you can tell my dedication, because our first daughter was born 6 weeks early after I'd just come back from the National Library of Scotland. I'd just been back 2 days, and she came 6 weeks early. I suspect that was my fault. And I spent a month in hospital, and I read dirty books out of the Picton Library in Liverpool. They were so filthy they had to be wrapped up in newspaper before they could be put on my bed, this sort of thing. You know, this was a sort of dedication. But Tom, on the other hand, cycled all over Scotland and the islands. We didn't have a car until about 1958, 1959. And he subsidised this by marking thousands and thousands of A-level papers. The university salaries were never very brilliant. I don't think they're very brilliant today, but in those days they certainly weren't very lavish. And if you've ever either marked A-level papers yourself or lived with anybody who has, it is hell, I can tell you. But even so, I mean, he did it on an absolute pittance. He paid about ½ a crown or 3 and 6pence for bed and breakfast, and he used to buy a tin of sliced peaches for his lunch, because he said in that way he got some vitamins, and he also got a drink for the same sort of price. And this was how we were doing it. And I would like, in a sense, to sort of, some of the things I bring in, I will say what collectors ought to look at, what they ought to be thinking about, and perhaps encourage some more people to go on collecting, because I mean this is still possible. And just to give you a very rough, quick background of why we started, because you probably wonder why on earth we did start, perhaps. Tom was born to Scottish parents. They'd just moved down from Glasgow in the they moved down just before he was born. And in the 1930s, his parents and mine moved out to Wembley when everybody started moving out of London to the new housing estates. And like expatriate Scots all over the world, the first thing Scots in Wembley did was form a Scottish society. And Tom's parents were founder members. And then the next thing they did, the thing that Scots had been doing for at least the last 200 years, they employed a dancing teacher to teach the children to dance. Because this was a very important part of education, both in England and in Scotland, but it's harder to find in England because transport's easier, things disappear quicker in England. But in Scotland, very, very important part of children's education. This was where they learned their etiquette, their social manners, how to behave in company. And a lovely illustration of that, this actually is from England, but Lord Chesterfield in 1745 wrote to his son. The son was 11 at the time. Now that Christmas breaking up draws near, I have orders Mr. Dinoye to go to you during that time to teach you to dance. I desire you will particularly attend to the graceful motion of your arms, which, with the manner of putting on your hat and giving your hand, is all that a gentleman need attend to. Dancing is in itself a very trifling, silly thing. It is one of those established follies to which people of sense are sometimes obliged to conform, and when they do, they should be able to do it well. And a few years later he wrote, "It seems ridiculous to tell you, but it is certainly true that your dancing master is at this time the man in all Europe of the greatest importance to you. You must dance well in order to sit, stand, and walk well, and you must do all these things well in order to please." And this was the attitude among all classes of society, not just the gentry and the nobility like Lord Chesterfield. So Tom and his brother were sent to this class, and they thought this was horror, you know, it's going to be some sissy dancing teacher. And when they got there, it was a 6-foot ex-pipe major of the Scots Guards who whacked their legs with a sword stick. They didn't turn their knees out enough. And Tom was absolutely hooked. He danced all his life until about 6 months before his death. I should say, for those who didn't know him, he died about 17 years ago. He was only 52, which was a very sad loss, both to mathematics and to the folk world as well. But he danced not only Scottish, but English, old-time, ballroom dancing. He was absolutely hooked on dancing. I did the usual roughy-tufty and black nag in school, and I blush to say that when I was about 13, I taught my guide patrol to do black nag and old mole or something like that, and I dressed the men in blue crepe paper sunbonnets and aprons, and the ladies in pink crepe paper bonnets. So I hide my face over that, but I was only, as I say, about 12 or 13. And I came to Scottish dancing through neighbours who took me to Scottish dancing, the local Scottish Society. I'd been in school with Tom when we were about 7 for 2 years, and then we re-met when we were about 18. And we first began to take an interest in the background of Scottish dancing in particular at that time. Tom went up to Cambridge to do a PhD as a mature student, and we'd been married after his first year. And then we met Professor Hugh Thurston, as he later became, another mathematician, and he had been the first person really to look into the background of Scottish dancing. He proved, of course, that Scottish dancing came from England in about 1700, when the Scots began to dance again after a couple of 100 years of strict Calvinism. And he was the first person really to do any work. He didn't go out into the field, though. He only did literary work. And we became interested and started to read ourselves. And just as a sideline, it's rather interesting because Cecil Sharp, in fact, was not only responsible for the English Folk Dance and Song Society, but indirectly for the Royal Scottish Country Dance Society. I bet you didn't know that. He had a disciple, a very, very keen disciple, Sylvia Stewart, who was a Scottish guider, and she taught her girl guides, you know, it's in the tradition, isn't it? She taught her girl guides English country dancing, which they showed at a festival in Edinburgh. And the Scottish commissioners said, why are the Scottish guides doing English dancing? Haven't we got any Scottish dances? And one of those commissioners was Mrs. Stewart of Fasnacloig. And she remembered her father saying that in his day, the whole evening was composed of country dances. By the time it was Mrs. Stewart's time, this is the sort of 1920s, she only remembered about half a dozen Scottish dances, country dances. And she set out with Miss Milligan to revive the dances, and so it went on from there. So I say, Cecil Sharp actually founded the Royal Scottish Country Dance Society, which is rather nice. And as I say, we began to read and read and read and read. And one of the first things you have to realise as a collector is that nobody writes down anything that's commonplace to them. You take it for granted. I mean, we were saying just a little while ago, I saw a quiz on television the other day, and one of the questions was, what's the Scottish dance, Gilly-Callum? And the person answering the question simply didn't know. And I thought, how could she not know that Gilly-Callum's a sword dance? You know, but that's true. People don't look at things. I mean, I know she actually didn't know what the dance was, but we would also take it for granted that we know about it, and you don't write it down. So you look for foreigners who do a tour, perhaps, and they see something that's very odd, and they write it down. They perhaps try to write down a dance, or they try to write down steps. Or you look in parish records. You see sometimes records of bells for geysers. The Maypole, Sheffield records. We had a Maypole in Sheffield, but you didn't know that, did you? You know, I can't remember what the date was. 1600 and something. We had a Maypole in Sheffield. I have three supporters from Sheffield here. And this sort of thing, promiscuous dancing appears in church records, the men dancing with women, or men disguised as women, promiscuous dancing. So you find all these things in records, and you should read and read and read all the time. I got to a stage so that any word like fling just leapt out of the page at me, whether it was anything to do with dance or not. And well, when we began to think about going out into the field, we thought, why should we, what made us do this? And three things in our case made us go out and start collecting. We were living on Merseyside, and at that time there were 51 Scottish societies on Merseyside. And the first year we were in Wallasey, we went to a ball at the old New Brighton Tower where the 51 societies all met. And people had different versions of quite a lot of the dances. The eights and reel, completely different versions of the eights and reel. But by the following year, everybody had been told of the programme in advance, so everybody had gone away and they'd mugged up a standard version of the dances. Then we took part in a competition for country dancing in Manchester, and we took a team, and we got our lines straight and our figures all worked out, and we had a uniform. The men had kilts and white shirts, and the girls had white blouses and kilts. And when we got there, we were sort of looked down on by, magnificent creatures in full Highland evening dress, and ladies in white petticoats and tartan sashes. And our adjudication papers were marked "ladies in kilts!" exclamation mark. We didn't do very well in our competition. And then we went to Highland Games, and of course we saw all the absolute standardised versions of the Games dances. 6 steps for the fling, 8 steps at the outside, these sorts of things. And we thought, did everybody really dance a standardised version of these things? Did they all wear gilly shoes? Did they all point their shoes so beautifully? And just as an example, in fact, we collected over 60 steps of the Highland Fling in the course of our work. So, as I say, people didn't have standardised versions of certain dances. And one of the other things that you have also to remember is that when you're reading through things, you should really, really go back to the first occurrence of something. You should check your sources. And I've just shuffled my papers at the moment. One of the things you must remember that you try and check everything that you possibly can. And several of the things we found, we actually checked. For instance, the dances that we collected in the Hebrides, the solo dances we collected in the Hebrides, were taught there by one Ewan McLaughlin, who was alleged to be a priest, and he had gone to the Scots College in Douai. And we checked back, and he hadn't gone to the Scots College in Douai. He hadn't been to any of the Scottish colleges as a priest. And in fact, he had short arms, like a thalidomide child. His hands were attached to his shoulders. And our Catholic friends told us that to be a priest, in fact, you have to be a whole man. But because there was this image that these were French dances, he brought them from France, people were a bit contemptuous about those dances in the old days. And if I just excuse me a minute, as I say, I've shuffled my papers while I was standing there talking. But one of the other things, I do really have to read out to you in order to illustrate this, because the first occurrence of Strathspey was alleged to be about 1606. And still done it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Let me just check sources I've got here. The first thing of Strathspey was alleged to be about 1606. There was a man called Zachary Boyd who wrote very humorous stories in verse of the Bible stories. And for example, one of his nice little ones was, and when the bed began to bob, Isaac begat Jacob. But he was talking about dancing in front of the ark, and he's supposed to have said, "To please the king, the Morris dance I will. Stravat spy, and after, last of all, the drunken dance I'll dance within that hall." And in fact, Tom found the original manuscript in Scotland, in Glasgow, and in fact, we couldn't say for absolute certainty because the writing was almost impossible to interpret, but almost certainly what Zachary Boyd wrote was, "And after that, with measure and with skill, to please the king, the Morris dance I will strive to essay. And last of all, the drunken dance I'll dance within that hall." So you see, just have to be a wee bit careful, and as I say, check back your sources as far as you possibly can, and make sure you really have gone back to your original source. Just hold on a second, and I will put my notes back in order again. I'm sorry about that. As I say, we started going out into to collect after we had this sort of vision of was this really the standardised versions of all these dances really correct? And at Easter we went to the Hebrides, and we had read and we'd found old Gaelic dances which were alleged to be forgotten, and we had a name from Peter Kennedy of a folk singer on Barra, Annie Johnson, who was supposed to be a great source of old lore. And this is another thing for a collector. It's very useful to have somebody to go to begin with, because if they can't help you, they will pass you on to somebody else. And you can then go and say, so-and-so suggested I came to see you. It's much easier than just starting cold. Because later on we did, in fact, get up to courage to sort of go up to old men on park benches, people waiting to go in the pub, or we'd go into the local post office and say, we're interested in dance, can you direct us to the oldest people in the village? This sort of thing. And we went, as I say, we started out, and we went to Barra via Col and Tyree. And one of the lessons we learnt there was the Hebridean attitude to time. The nice story of the Englishman who was going fishing, and he'd asked the local fisherman to meet him at 10:30, say. And the time went on, and the time went on, and it got to about 2:30. And when the fisherman eventually turned up, the Englishman said, "My good man, do you know what time it is?" He said, "Aye, it's Thursday." So you have to sort of get used to this. And also, very often people would direct you to somebody they regarded as an expert. And this is not necessarily what a collector wants, because it may be somebody who's gone away, say to Teachers Training College, and learnt their dancing somewhere completely different. We were quite frequently said, "Oh, so-and-so is marvellous dancer." But they learnt their dancing, down in Edinburgh or Glasgow, which wasn't what we wanted out in the Hebrides. And we were directed, in fact, I should say, in fact, Annie Johnson got off the boat that we got on, which we got off, which was a shame, and she sailed away to Oban. So we missed Annie Johnson, which was rather a shame when we actually got to Barra. And we were directed to the local schoolmaster, who was Neil McNeil. And 90% of the men in fact 90% of the population was McNeil, and 75% of the men appeared to be Neil McNeil. So we walked around the island, and we found this wonderful tall man, ginger hair, piercing blue eyes, real Viking type. And we said, Neil McNeil. And he said, "Aye." And we started talking about dancing, and he suddenly said, "It's my father you want." Father was 89, and the wonderful thing about father was that he'd been a piper. And although it was 60 years since he'd danced, because he was a piper, he could remember the phrasing of all the dances. And do the Reading Clubbies still do Carnagaluk and Wiener? We collected those dances from Neil McNeil, and he knew precisely how they had been done, which was absolutely wonderful. We had trouble with the Gaelic, because interestingly enough, you see, at that time, Neil McNeil at 89 had gone to school, hardly had gone to school, so he couldn't read or write, and he only spoke Gaelic. The next generation down had gone to school when only English was taught in schools. So the next generation could read and write English, but they spoke Gaelic at home. So we had to have the third generation if we wanted something written down in Gaelic, because they were much more enlightened by the time it came to the children, and they were learning both in school. So we had Neil McNeil talking Gaelic, daughter-in-law translating, children writing it down if we wanted anything written down. But you can imagine our feeling. These were dances were supposed to be completely forgotten. And we just danced down the road afterwards, literally danced down the road, because we were so thrilled that there was really stuff to find. And another lesson for collectors: know what you're looking for. You've done your reading beforehand. Don't prompt, because people like to please you, and they will say what you think they think you would like them to hear. This is the thing. And if you find somebody who's too infirm to dance, very often they can dance supported by two people, or they can sit and twiddle their feet. Or if the worst comes to the worst, you can show them steps and say which was the nearest to the one you remember. But as I say, don't prompt, because as I say, people like to please you. We went on then to South Uist and Benbecula, and amongst other things that we found, we found these solo dances, we found reels and this sort of thing. But a fascinating dance that we found there was Carnagadoogan, which is a dance which we think of as almost as more like our English dances that go in front of a sword dance or a rise dance, where someone's killed and is revived. And the dance was first mentioned in Perthshire in 1804, and we found it still known in the Hebrides. They'd last danced it actually in a house on Benbecula 5 years before we were there. And I think it's worth just reading it to you because it's quite fascinating. There's a dance called Carlick-and-Durdin, the carling of the mill dust. And I should mention that the corn used in the Hebrides gives a black dust. So again, if you were working with that, you would have a black face, which again is quite an interesting relationship between blacking of the face. It's a Punch and Judy dance and has a special pipe tune for itself called Carlick-and-Durdin. Two take part in the dance, an old man and an old, trembling, shivering hag. A man dressed in punch attire does her part. The old hag comes in trembling and quivering with a stick in her hand, and her husband similarly armed. They fight with sticks, dancing all the time. Finally, the old man thrusts his stick into her body and she falls down dead. The old man beats his hands and howls most atrociously. And then it occurs to him he's murdered the old woman. and the sudden change from anger to animosity to broken-heartedness for the loss of his partner in life is ridiculous. He bends down over her, only to find out more surely that she is dead. The lamentation is heart-rending. Again and again he bends over her, and again his sorrow is only intensified. He bends down and touches her boot, and her foot, and it begins to shake incessantly. And at these signs of returning life, he bursts into hysterical laughter. He touches the hands one by one, and they too begin to quiver. And the old carlin stretched out on the floor with her 2 feet and her 2 hands quivering looks ridiculous to a degree, and the spectators nearly drown the piper with their uproar. The old man then bends down and touches her hair, and finally she springs up with renewed life, and they rush into each other's arms and dance most gleefully. By the time it got to Angus John's time, this gentleman in whose house we found it, the old hag was supposed to be drunk, and the husband comes home and finds her drunk. But the same sort of thing, exactly the same. The death and then the sort of the resurrection, which is quite fascinating. And in Angus John's house, we found our first true Cayley. We were sitting around a peat stove with Angus John and his wife, and people began to drift in, and nobody said anything. They weren't introduced, we weren't introduced, and we felt terribly self-conscious. And we sort of had this feeling that Angus John was sending up smoke signals, sort of saying, come and see these peculiar people. But of course, this was what a Cayley was. In the evening, there would be a house in a village where perhaps somebody played the pipes, somebody played the fiddle, somebody told stories, and the neighbours would just come in and just drift in, and they sat until it was time appropriate. They could join in the conversation or whatever happened. And one old lady said to us on the mainland near Oban, she said, sadly, now neighbours seldom call, and when they do, they rap on the door. But that's a true Cayley, as it used to be in the old days. Then in September 1953, we went to the Borders, and of course a different story really in the Borders. We were beginning to know what to do, we were getting to know how to conduct an interview. There was always the bush to erect and beat round. But in the Hebrides, we were collecting dances that hadn't been done for 60 years, or in the case of the Caligadurden, 5 years before, but that was very unusual. And in the Borders, of course, we were finding dances that had been done right up until the First World War, and very often right up until the 1920s, 1930s. So we were able to find complete stories. Tom would often visit everybody over 65 in a particular village, so he got a complete story, not only the dancing, but the life in that village, the social life, who did what and how, and the agriculture, and all these things, a complete background of the life in that village. And of course we found again that the dancing master was very important. In the villages there would be, there might be a dancing master, but you had the itinerant dancing masters who went round. In the bigger towns you had 2 dancing masters probably. You had somebody who catered to the children of the gentry, and you had somebody who catered to the children of the artisans and the agricultural workers. But again, the manners, absolutely important. One old man said, you have to be mannerly when lifting your partner. Know as if you were drawing a hogger or a ditch. And another one said, you have to take your partner back to your seat, no throw away like a hot potato. Again, as I say, completely, manners were the important thing. This was part of the class. 2 nice dances we found, both in the Borders, or rather one nice dance we found in the Borders and in the Hebrides, the kissing reel. The last dance of the evening, somebody going around with a handkerchief. It descends from the old cushion dance, where somebody in the old days, in medieval days, took a cushion down and you put it in front of the lady or the gentleman, and you kissed, and they got up to dance, they walked round, and it had got down to the stage where this was done with a handkerchief. It probably went from a cushion to a pillow, from a pillow to a pillowcase, from a pillowcase to a handkerchief. And various versions of it. Sometimes somebody would lay it down on the floor and dance a few steps of the sword dance across it. Always the last dance in the evening. Somebody said very often they used to like to have it because they knew who was going out with who was going to take somebody home, this sort of thing. And sometimes the fellows would bar the door so that the girls didn't, run away and not be kissed. And so you went round, an invitation dance. Take it to the first man went round, give it to a lady gives it to the next man, and always with the kissing. And the pipers would either play the phrase Porga Toshak, as they called it, which is kiss first on the pipes, or the fiddlers would squeak above the bridge, with this squeaking noise until everybody had kissed, and they made everybody do this, a sort of great fun dance. But one of my most vivid memories in the Borders was collecting a broom dance. I was delighted to see a broom dance this afternoon. Terribly poor household. an old lady, very, very old lady, a daughter, miscellaneous children over on one side in a bed, a potty on the floor, holes through the floorboards, terribly, terribly poor house. And the old lady sat at the table with me and she sort of clutched my arm and she talked to me. Couldn't understand a word she said. And I just hoped Tom was sitting there taking it all in. And the daughter knew a broom dance. And in order to demonstrate this, she put her father's trousers on. She was a huge, great, ungainly lady. She put her father's trousers on. She screwed them up like this. And all her skirt was out the front. And it wagged about as she did this broom dance. The sort of broom dance where you hold the broom in one hand and you cock your leg over it and swap it from one hand to the other. Quite incredible vision of this lady. I mean, I can see it to this day. And then, as I say, we continued to read and read and read. And we went on afterwards to, sort of really finding out different things, the traditions of places. The social dances of Scotland and England, of course, had reached great popularity in urban ballrooms, and then when you went into the country districts, of course, country things crept in. In Scotland and the north of England, you had what we call the Cumberland wrestling style, where the lady puts her hands on the man's shoulder and he clutches her around the waist rather than ballroom hold. And both the two-handed hold and that come from the waltz originally, of course. You had a two-handed hold in the waltz, then you had the half support, which is what we have as our ballroom hold today, and you had the full support, say, where the lady put her hands on the man's shoulders or around his neck, if she was tall enough, he clutched around her waist. And when the Scottish Country Dance Society was shown some of these dances using that form of hold, they said this was too vulgar. They couldn't possibly use this. And the North Country ladies' chain, where you yank your partner around and sort of throw her out the other side, that comes from the Allemand hold. Well, it is. I mean, it depends who does it. But, the Allemand dance from Germany, there are all sorts of two-hand holds. One-hand turns. You can turn your partner in all sorts of ways. And the North Country chain is just derived from that hand. In fact, what man should do, as he takes the lady round, he should turn with her, and he goes round with her and holds her hand. It's, as I say, country style, you jump around and you throw her off in that direction. And of course, costume plays an enormous part. I mean, when we had hoop skirts and things like that, it took much longer to do your reels. You had to go around. Somebody was 6 foot wide. It took much longer. And when slimmer dresses came in for the ladies, instead of going up to the top of the set, casting off elegantly, you came up to the second place, and you took War's hold, or you took Cumberland wrestling style, and you either polkaed or you waltzed on the spot. Or as the Scots said, we just burbled. You just spun on the spot. And things like Nottingham Swing, you would find Nottingham Swing different versions in the two villages next door to one another, because some of them would go up to the top and cast off, some would just come up to second place and swing, and this sort of thing. Footwear, again, a tremendous effect on dance, as I mentioned before. Before 1900, before the First World War, there was only one maker of ghillie shoes in the whole of Scotland, and only professional dancers or people taking part in Highland Games ever wore those. The men wore their Sunday boots, which were their working boots, the next year, or their best shoes if they did have shoes. The ladies wore whatever was popular at that time, and being ladies, they would be, say, an inch heel, and you cannot be precise in that sort of footwear. So the old dancing teachers were concerned with you getting into the right place at the right moment, but they weren't concerned with how you did it, and you had none of the beautiful glide and the beautiful stepping that you have today with Scottish dancing. And the time factor is also interesting, how long it takes from a dance to get from A to B, because, of course, as I said before, country dancing was introduced into Scotland in 1700. It was 1890 before it reached places like the Orkneys and the Shetlands. And the quadrilles were introduced into Edinburgh immediately after the Napoleonic Wars in 1816. But again, it was the 1880s, 1890s before it got to the extremes of the country. And Tom had one lovely story up in Orkney. An old lady told him in about the 1890s, a young man had been across to the mainland, and he'd come back with some of the new dances like Petronella, and he'd apparently been an awful show-off. And she said to Tom, but he's deed new for all his bragging. Which is lovely. So we started to collect in England, really more by accident than design. Tom used to take maths reading parties to Burton Manor in the Wirral, where I've gone for my summer holidays every year for the last 16 years. In fact, there have been 2 country dance schools, summer schools and the winter weekend there for the last 45 years. Burton Manor in the Wirral, terribly popular with those who know it. Absolutely gorgeous place. This is the first year there hasn't been a course there for 45 years. And Tom used to take maths reading parties, and because it's the sort of place where it's a totally isolated village, there's no pub, there's no nothing, and he used to put on dancing in the evening just to keep the students occupied. And one day the warden, as it was in those days, it's now a principal, at dinner said to him, you obviously know something about dancing, could you put on something, he said, a little bit more intelligent than the usual Hoofers weekend that we have here. It was ages before we dared tell the organiser of our Hoofers weekend that that's what the warden regarded it as. And Tom agreed, but he came home and he thought, ye gods, I know all the literature, but I really don't know anything about in the field in England. But of course we've learnt a lesson, again this is a lesson for collectors. You'll find things more easily in places that have been absolutely isolated, where there's been bad communication, transport's been difficult, the terrain has been difficult for people to move about in. And we were living on Merseyside, and of course the Lake District is absolutely ideal for that, or was in those days. This is the 1950s. Because transport had been by very bad roads. It had been by horse and cart, or it had been across the sands from Morecambe to the lower part of the Lake District by horse and cart. And by this time we did have a car, which was marvellous. We'd also, again, been given a name. There was Dan Howison, I don't know whether anybody knew him. He was squire of the Manchester Morris men at that time. And the Morris men had been up and done a tour around the Lake District, and he knew about Norman Robinson. And so we had Norman to go to. And also, of course, by this time, Tom had learnt all the step dancing in Scotland, the sorts of things you've seen today. I should say that the only time we were ever refused information was the first time we found club dancing. We found it in Dalbeattie, and this little man knew all the dances. He used the Liverpool hornpipe and all these sorts of things. But his wife wouldn't let him tell us anything. She was quite convinced we were going to go away and write a book and make lots of money. Wouldn't it have been nice if we could have done? But anyway, that was, as I say, the first time. So Tom already had the dancing in his feet. And when he asked Norman Robinson if Norman would show him all the dances that you know from Westmoreland, Norman said, well, have you got about 3 weeks? And in fact, he taught Tom more or less everything he knew that first time in 3 days. I mean, we did go back continuously. I mean, he just became a friend, and we were always backwards and forwards. And this little thing also we found, again for a collector, it's useful to be able to go back to people. It's also very useful to write down your notes the same day, and then if you've got something you're not sure about, you go and check. Also, as I say, if you go back after a length of time, you've made the wheels go working, and somebody's been talking to their friends and their family. Tom went back to see Neil MacNeil in Barra some years later, and although he'd had a stroke, he'd forgotten a lot, but he'd remembered other things. So again, as I say, for collectors, go back and check, and also go back perhaps a little while later and see if people have remembered anything in the meanwhile. And sometimes serendipity played a part. The Oxford Dictionary says serendipity is making unexpected and happy discoveries by accident. And I'm now going on just a sort of random little things that I thought you might find interesting, just not actually a coherent story, but things that cropped up which are nice. We drove up into Wyresdale one year on holiday, and we knew that Cecil Sharp had collected Greensleeves, the three men's Morris, up there, and we wondered if anybody had any memories of this. And we saw a man hedging and ditching, and we stopped and we said, why we were there and what. And he was married to the niece of the man who'd given Cecil Sharp the manuscript with the music in, and had taught him Greensleeves, which is absolutely fantastic. He took us home, he showed us the manuscript, the notebook from which Cecil Sharp took his music and all this sort of thing. Not only that, but the Percy family had a little arithmetic book dated 1827, which had belonged to a local dancer. And of course, Tom, being a mathematician, greatly interested, and they lent it to him. And he wrote an article for the Teachers' Mathematical Journal, and that brought him correspondence from all over the world. It was just incredible. It brought him on more correspondence about that one little booklet than all his learned things, that were sort of on this level, this sort of thing. Just absolutely brought, wonderful things into him. And one of the nice stories told up there at that time, all the musical instruments that they used to use for the dancing were kept in the church, and they also used to use them for playing the church services on Sunday morning. And they told the story that the band leader one day up in the gallery sort of fell fast asleep during the sermon, and and somebody poked him when the sermon finished, and he said, "Right, boys, deal among the tailors." But this story, I must say, I think is also told by Hardy. So whether that story really went from Dorset up to there, I don't know. But it's a nice story anyway. But they certainly did have all the musical instruments actually kept in the church, which was lovely to see. And this brings me to Dorset, of course. We went to Dorset to try and find the origins of the Dorset four-hand wheel and see if people really did use the ramp step, which everybody was using. And as I think most of you know, they didn't. I think that's quite well known now, that they didn't actually use the ramp step, although one can see why they had used it, because one of the Dorset steps is a sort of step where you've got almost the same rhythm, but you do cross your feet over, and you lift your leg and cross and step like that. So one could see, as I say. But again, serendipity, we drove into Bridport, and we stopped at the garage for petrol, and we said to the man why we'd come, and he was, let me just check, he was the garage owner was the nephew of the tambourine player who had always played for the dance before it was revived in 1948. And again, you see, he sent us on to all sorts of other people, which was absolutely wonderful. And Dorset provides another example of where you can find material. Some of you might remember I wrote an article some years ago for the English Dance and Song about the poems in Dorset dialect. And again, one of these places, the things you find references to dancing in poetry as well as everything else. Lovely stories about dancing in the green in front of the pub in the old days of the club walks, the old friendly societies, that you paid to before the National Health Service for your health things, and particularly for funerals, your expenses for funerals, you were paying in all your life in order to pay for your funeral. And they used to have club walks, and they danced on the green. And birthday parties with ladies dancing their high-heely shoes, as he put it. And birthday parties, all sorts of things. Even two young boys talking about fairy rings, and they say these great fairy rings in the Dorset dialect. I won't attempt to do it, but he says, the fairies, when they dance, they make these, great rings and this sort of thing. So all sorts of little things you can find, making a picture of dancing in a village in Dorset in about 1850. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. What time did you want us to finish, seeing we started late? Just give me a clue.
I don't know.
We were about 20 minutes late, weren't we?
Yeah.
So, okay, well I've got a little while. Anyway, it's 7:05, is that all right? What about the meal? Will that be all right?
I think that goes on to half
7:30.
half
7:30.
past 7.
Do they know we're running
They
late?
said they were keeping all the meals that were booked. But perhaps if we're running late, it might be kind if somebody popped out and told them.
Well, I'll sort of, quickly hurry up. I'll skip my please don't.
Marion will go out and tell them.
Okay. I mentioned serendipity. Going back to Scotland, one time serendipity took a long time to work for us. The only other person to collect from oral tradition in Scotland was a man called I.C.B. Jemison in the 1920s. He only collected very, very roughly. He just jotted notes down on backs of envelopes, bits of scraps of paper. He was the factor of a large estate near Galashiels, and he collected from the farm workers and the shepherds and people like that, mainly for his wife's Women's Rural Institute and his own men's club, which he taught. And he made a film of his team. And when he died, Tom went to see Mrs. Jimison. He died in 1954. Unfortunately, we didn't know he was still alive. We assumed he was dead, and you can imagine how distressed we were when we read his obituary in the Weekly Scotsman. But Mrs. Jameson had said to Tom that she'd sent his films and his projector to the local hospital. And she suggested that Tom went to the local hospital and asked for the film on dancing back. And the hospital were terribly embarrassed to confess that because the projector was broken, they'd thrown the whole lot in the incinerator. But 10 years later, somebody opened a drawer in that hospital. I don't know what sort of hospital it was, that somebody only opened a drawer after 10 years, and found one film, and it was the film of the dancing. And they sent it to the School of Scottish Studies, and they sent it on to us. And of course, it was an old 8mm film, and of course it's been reprinted now by the School of Scottish Studies, so we can actually see people dancing in the 1930s. The film was made in 1930, and it's quite fascinating to see the original untouched dancing in the, just as they would have done, and then dancing after they'd been slightly influenced by the Royal Scottish Country Dance Society. and a lovely one of an old dancing master dancing and fiddling at the same time in front of a group of ladies at one of the first St Andrews school, because all the old dancing teachers, well, almost all of them could dance and fiddle at the same time. Lovely film. As I say, Serendipity took 10 years to work. Just one or two things, just to sort of finish, just fun things. The accidental introduction of dancing is interesting. Dent has the highest railway station in Britain. It still has a station, although I don't. Yes, it still has the Settle to Carlisle Railway, of course. So it does still have the highest railway station in Britain. And one of the workmen who worked on that in the 1880s was a Mr. Urquhart, who came down from Scotland. And he used to walk down from Scotland, and he used to bring his food for the week on a stick over his shoulder in a red spotted handkerchief sort of thing, you know, this sort of thing. And he paid £half a crown for his bed and his lodging, and he put on dancing classes in the evenings to while away the time between October and March. And again, he taught all the etiquette of the ballroom, although he was teaching very roughly in a bar or something like that. Again, the boys had to ask their partners to dance properly, they had to take it back to their seats, all this sort of thing. And at the fairs in Dent and Hawes, dancing took place in the pubs on fair day, and there was a dancing teacher called Pop John Mason, and he hired the out room, and he charged a penny for the dance. The men paid, the ladies didn't. And he used to go around with one of these pouches like old-fashioned bus conductors had, collecting the pennies, this sort of thing. My aunts in Oxford remembered on fair day in Oxford, St Giles Fair, there used to be a dancing booth, and again they used to pay a penny. My great aunts remembered that. Another occasion was the Beaters' Ball in Dentdale. The last time I was in Dentdale, the house belonged to Lady Henry Bentinck. It was a youth hostel when I was there last, but they would have a Beaters' Ball and everybody would come in and they would dance and that sort of thing. You have to remember too, the effect of teaching and how it's taught. Very often you would find people teaching in one family. The Beresford family in Langstrothdale, and incidentally, only a fortnight ago, I saw the current Beresfords playing. They still have a band. There's a man and a wife, they call themselves the Beresford Band. But they all learnt to dance in their own home, and they'd have the neighbours in, and they would teach, if there's enough people in the family, this sort of thing. You teach in the family. This was a great thing in Scotland. I mean, the dancing teacher would actually come to one house in Scotland and teach a large family, or perhaps with a few neighbours in to make up the numbers. And again, you have to remember too the effect of repertoire. In the old days, I mean, one of the dances this afternoon, you did the small dance with only 4 people. I've forgotten who did it, saying dancing in a small room. Was it one of the Irish ones? No. It was Chris, wasn't it? One of the Irish ones. Yes, one of the Irish ones. Dances at round the dresser. Round the dresser. You see, if you only dance perhaps once or twice in an evening, because you've got a small room in a croft kitchen, or in a barn, or whatever it is, sometimes when the hay had been taken out of the barn and half taken out, you would dance. You've got quite a small space. And so you might only get up once or twice in an evening. So it doesn't matter how big the repertoire is. It doesn't matter what steps you've got. The joy of the dancing comes from the atmosphere. It comes from the music bouncing off the walls. Perhaps in a croft kitchen you've got the piper or the fiddler stuck up on the table in the corner and the whiskey going round. And this is what makes the dancing. So again, you have to remember the effect on repertoire. And it was only when the first village halls came in, of course, you started to get your long ways country dances back in again, as they'd been in the old assembly rooms, you know, in the 18th, 17th century. The Robinsons, just one thing, of course, you all know about the Robinsons and the Lakeland dancing. Young Joss Robinson and his wife used to travel to their castles by horse and cart. And the horse knew his way home, so the Robinsons used to go to sleep on the way home. But there was one pub where the man, if they knew they were going past, he would put out a bale of hay for them. So the horse would always stop on the way home for his bale of hay, this sort of thing. The Cowpers, again, did some dances from the Cowpers. Mr. Cowper, when he was in York, used to walk to all his country dancing classes, often through thick snow. And one time he got entangled in the telegraph wires that had been brought down by the snow. And one of the lovely stories that his daughters told, this was before the Cowper family moved across to Whitehaven. One of the dances they taught was the skirt dance, and this was always done in a very full, soft dress. And one of his little girl dancers had finished her skirt dance, and she was taking her bow on the stage. And the curtain was one of the old-fashioned sort that rolled up from the bottom. And she was so close to it that it caught her skirt, and it rolled her skirt up inside the curtain, and her underwear was progressively exposed. And the Mrs. Cowper said, it's the best part of the evening. And I think just one last thing to say, the enormous pleasure that people had from dancing, and of course that we had from collecting, they just glowed with pleasure. And one old lady up in the Lake District in 1927 said, foxtrots and one-steps are very dull after the ardours and triumphs of step dancing. So I think that's a very good place to stop, isn't it? The triumphs and ardours of step dancing, which is what you've had this afternoon. But again, I emphasise, I think that you have to remember that there's still stuff to be collected. There's a lot of literary stuff. I mean, my daughter in Bolton found at the local library, notices of the dancing classes in Bolton in 1826. Different parts of the country you will find all these things, and also that we don't write down what is commonplace to us. And what are our grandchildren going to think? They will say, well, how did we dance? This sort of thing. So can I encourage people to, think about going on and doing this? Anyway, the ardours and pleasures of step dancing. I think they've earned you a meal. With a wire binding by special request of the Reading Cloggies, because I gathered the plastic one broke, and there's a few copies of this.
Right, thank you very much. You actually rang a bell for me when you talked about the Aitson reel, because I'm not into collecting or anything, but I was invited with two girls to go up for a Hebridean holiday to help share the cost of the car, and we were looking for Scottish dances, and we went to Uist, South Uist, and we actually found a Scottish dance, and it didn't start till 9 o'clock or 10 I think, and we turned up and there was cars all outside, we could see them all drinking away, walked through the door, and paid our money as we went in. On the stage was the MC and the band. He was playing the piano accordion with a foot drum. He was the master of ceremonies, he did everything. On one side of the hall were all the girls, and on the other side were all the boys, and there was me with two girls. So we walked and sat at the end of the hall in between. And the evening gradually warmed up, and we saw all the waitresses at our hotel there. So we reckon they put the kind of residents to bed, and then they went out and enjoyed themselves. But they did a dance, and I didn't twig at the time. It was the Aitson, because we formed a reel. The music started, he announced the dance, he didn't tell you any more. It gradually started going to the left and gradually built up speed, and we went round and round, and people got fed up with that, so it slowed down and kind of came to a stop, and then it started going the other way, and so we worked through the Aitson. All the other sets finished, sat down, and we kept going. And when we stopped, the musicians stopped. That was the Aitson, totally different, wasn't standardised at all. But yeah, it lines up with what you're saying here. Very fascinating lecture.
Yes, that's not all that long ago.
No.
But it's terribly true. It's absolutely typical.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Joan. Well, Chris wants to say something. What do you want to say, Chris?
It's actually nothing to do with the lecture. But I will say something about the lecture. About 10 years ago I was worried about the standardisation of English folk dance, and I was talking to somebody at Sidmouth about it. Actually it was Peter Dashwood, and we were looking in the Ham Marquee at one of these ceilidhs, and he was saying, good grief, what on earth will our grandchildren think of the dance tradition of the day? And then I got talking to other people, and I was talking to Eddie Upton, and I said, Eddie, where are the traditional dances? And he said, well, if you go and look and go and find them, you will find the old musicians, like Scantester, you will find the old MCs, and the traditional dances you will find will be the regional variants of the quadrilles. And but unfortunately I didn't take the hint, and that was 10 years ago. But I'm still convinced the stuff is out there.
Anyway, the point is, I think we're probably all here today because of Joan and Tom. Through that, everything stemmed. The Reading Cloggies, if the Reading Cloggies hadn't existed today, wouldn't exist. So we're all here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.